Dave, in the works of Aristotle, there's a treasure chest of great advice and insights and truths. And one of them, Aristotle pointed out, when there's a big project, something needs to be done, he said, to have begun is to be half done. Because sometimes the hardest thing is just getting started, right? If you can actually get going, it's like you're halfway done because now you're working on the thing.
Sure.
And that's even true with podcasts sometimes, just to get the thing started, right? Figuring out what kind of material we're going to use at the beginning, get some momentum going, and then we develop a rhythm. And it's especially hard to have begun and be half done when we're doing this remote, when we're not in the same room with each other. But we got to do that this week because you're under the weather, but you're like an athlete. You're playing while you're hurt.
I was going to ask you, did Aristotle in that whole trove of good advice,
Yeah.
do you have any advice on how to get through an illness?
No, well,
I could really use that right now.
He does have some very good advice about how to suffer well. I kid you not. This is an important part of his teaching in the ethics, because there are people who, when suffering, they're whiny and they complain and they make everyone miserable around them. And his point is that's not what a virtuous person does. A virtuous person suffers well. So, Dave, our hope, all your fans out there, your adoring fans, we all hope that you're suffering well this week.
I will do my best to keep a smile on my face through the next hour and
good
and fight off this flu that I've been facing for the last couple of days.
All right, Dave, I'm going to ask you the obvious question everyone wants to know. Do you have COVID?
No, at least my doctor thinks that I don't.
Yeah.
We've talked about it quite often. You know, you have to find a doctor who you trust and believe in, and decisions are made between the two of you. And he and I did a video chat a couple days ago, and he asked me a million questions, and he said, this is unquestionably the flu. You have the basic symptoms of the flu. I'm not showing any of the major COVID symptoms, and he's put me on a very mild flu medication, and I'm 2 days in and already feeling significantly better.
Good. Well, we appreciate you being here, and you're at home. You're keeping your germs there, and you can go back to bed and rest as soon as we're done with our work. What are we talking about this week?
I thought it would be an interesting conversation for us to really dig into the meaning of words. We hear all the time different people say, oh, this means this or this means that. I think about the term liberal as a perfect example, where people try to co-opt a word. They try to take ownership of it and change its meaning. And over time, there might not be a better example than the word liberal.
Yeah.
You look back at our country's founders, you look back at John Locke, you even look back at Aristotle, and you think of them as your classical definition of liberals. And now today, it means something completely different.
Well, and we'll dig into that a little deeper. Those words with significant political meaning and what how they've changed over time. I have in my mind kind of two models of how to think about words in general, any words, whether they're political words or other kinds of words. One is a beautiful little treatise that I'm going to recommend strongly to people, and it's kind of a classic. It's C.S. Lewis's. It's not even a treatise. It's not even really a book. It's a lengthy essay titled "The Abolition of Man," and the whole movement of the essay takes off with an analysis of words. Do words reflect whatever we are feeling inside, whatever the speaker is feeling? Or, this is the argument C.S. Lewis wants to make, do words reflect an objective reality out there? Are words representative of something real, something objective, something external to us? And we see the same kind of theme in a very different way, a very humorous way, in that great, classic comedy, Alice in Wonderland. I mean, it's sort of a comedy. It's also kind of dark and creepy. Yeah.
So,
But there's this great exchange with it's Alice, and I'm trying to think who was it, the Cheshire Cat? I don't remember which figure it was, but he says, when I say a word, when I speak a word, it means whatever I want it to mean at that moment, right? And Alice is really confused by this. Well, how can you have a language of words if we don't agree with each
yeah.
other on what they mean? And in a way, that's our great challenge, is to get back to this notion that there's a reality all around us. We have, over time, through practice, through custom, through interactions, we have assigned certain words as symbols, right? A word is just either a written or a spoken
Hmm.
symbol. It's representing something, whether it's a physical thing. Mount Everest is a particular physical. It's a mountain, but it can also be an idea. It can be something we remember from the past. It can be an action, but it represents something outside of us, something objective. And if that's true,
Sure.
then the burden is sort of on us to learn these words and learn because learning language really means you're learning the reality that language reflects or represents, versus kind of the postmodern, post-truth progressive view, which is we just use language in a kind of willy-nilly fashion, and we throw out words. If we really don't know what they mean, that's okay, because we assign the meaning to them.
And we can change them. First of all, I believe, and I could be wrong on this, but I believe the Alice in Wonderland conversation was with Humpty Dumpty.
Oh, that might be. It's been
But
a long,
I could
long
be
time.
wrong about that.
Yeah, that you might very
But
well be
I
right.
think it was with Humpty Dumpty.
Yeah.
As far as what you're talking about with words, I mean, I think we've even talked about this in the last couple of podcasts when we've been talking about education. I mean, remember, at its very core, the very first thing kids do, kids start learning words.
Yes.
And kids start learning how to form words, and it's the very foundation of their ability to do anything in this world, is to actually understand how to communicate those things. And by doing that, they have to understand what a word means, right? If a parent is trying to teach their kids, they're trying to potty train their child, as an example. If the parent keeps saying to the kid, you've got to go use the toilet, you've got to go use the toilet, and the kid doesn't know what a toilet is, then there's no
There's
no way to
problem.
actually improve. There's no way for the kid
You're right.
to actually do that.
You're right.
And it also goes back to some previous conversations we've had about animals, right? Animals don't necessarily, when you tell a dog to sit,
Mhm.
that dog doesn't understand the meaning of sit. He understands that when you say make that sound, he's supposed to do that action. But it's the same thing, right? There just has to be this general understanding of this sound means this thing.
Right. Put it this way, to really build on how Aristotle defined logos as articulate speech. It's impossible to ask a dog. Well, you can ask the dog. It's impossible for a dog to understand and respond to the question, is it more comfortable to stand or to sit? Right? The dog cannot
Yeah.
articulate an answer that he prefers standing or prefers sitting, right? And the reasons why. He has come to associate, I hear that sound and I get a treat when I put my butt down on the ground, right?
Right.
And so, you're absolutely right when I'm reminded Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia, he gave a beautiful little summary of the genesis, the germ of learning. And it really begins with imitation. And he's right about this, and the classics agreed with this. Imitation. When you think of children at the youngest age, a child who's only 6, 8, 10 months old, when they very first start to verbalize, they're not even speaking yet. They're making babbling sounds. And what are they doing? No one has taught them to babble. You don't sit down, right, with an 8-month-old and say, now, today, we're going to exercise our babbling skills, right? And you don't do that.
Yeah.
The little baby is just watching and hearing and wants to do what he sees other people doing. and starts to babble. And then that babble eventually starts to form into very basic words, mama, daddy. Usually no is one of the very first words that they learn, much to the annoyance of young parents, no.
Right.
But the point is, we don't have to send a baby to a special institution, a special school with certified educators, right? Specialists in language to teach them to start speaking. They do it on their own. They do it. In fact, you can't stop them. You can't stop them from starting to speak by imitating what they see other people do. And it truly is one of the great beautiful mysteries or miracles of human life, this capacity for articulate speech, for the mind to perceive things around us and then to assign language, to assign words to those things. And then the mind has the ability to mix those words up, assemble them in different, in an infinite number of ways, into sentences, into paragraphs, into books, so that we can actually communicate with each other, not only across space, but across time. So, I just mentioned Aristotle. Aristotle could write a sentence or a paragraph or a book 2,000 years ago, and you and I can open that book up today, and we can read it, and we can understand what he was articulating, and we can, maybe we agree, maybe we disagree, maybe we want to challenge it. We can actually have a conversation across time because of language. It's that important.
And the important part in that, the very core of that, is that language is consistent, right?
Yes.
That language means the same thing to me that it does to you, that it does to anybody else. And if we don't agree on what different words mean and what the definitions are, then there's no purpose in having a language at all.
Well, and this becomes especially important politically if you happen to live in a nation that was founded upon certain ideas expressed in words, and then just as importantly, you create a government by writing words down in a written constitution, and everyone agreed that this is going to be the guidebook here. If there's ever a question of whether government should have a power or should exercise a power, we made the agreement, well, we'll go look at our constitution. We wrote down those words. We're going to look at those words. And for those who say, well, the meaning of words change, and so the Constitution really is a living or evolving document. The meaning is changing and evolving. I mean, think of key words like at the very beginning, you have the preamble is the first sentence of the Constitution, and then the next sentence, it's the first sentence of Article 1, says, all legislative power herein granted, that is here in the Constitution, all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress, which shall consist of House of Representatives and a Senate, period. Now, that's a really important statement because it says, first of all, the legislative power that's granted to government is the legislative power granted herein. If it's not granted through the Constitution, then government doesn't have it. And the legislative power is going to be granted not just to the entire federal government, but to one part of it, the Congress. So all legislative power granted herein shall be vested in a Congress. Well, does all mean all, or does all mean some? Does it mean some of the powers will be herein granted shall be vested in Congress, and there'll be other legislative powers, not listed here in the Constitution, that maybe will be vested in maybe an EPA, right? Or a Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration, or some regulatory agency.
I was going to say OSHA's a particularly interesting one right now.
Yeah, because they're implementing all these vaccine mandates that are coming from executive orders from the president to the Department of Labor to OSHA. They're the regulatory agency that's in charge of actually implementing these things. And so we want to know, as citizens, we want to know, well, are these things actually constitutional? And then we open up the Constitution and we find the very first word. The first word of the first sentence of Article 1 is all legislative power herein shall be granted, vested in a Congress, not an OSHA, not a Department of Labor, a Congress. So does all really mean all, or does all mean some, or does it mean something else? Knowing what the words mean turn out to have huge political and moral and social and cultural implications.
Tom, you're talking about all about Article 1, Section 1, but I think this can go even back to the Declaration first, right? We've talked at length in previous podcasts. We've talked about how Jefferson didn't just write one draft of the Declaration and said, "Okay, here it is, it's done." He had help, and among that was Ben Franklin making arguably one of the most important changes to that document.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. That famous second sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," that was not Jefferson's original language. In his first draft, he wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Ben Franklin came along, and there's a rough draft that has edits made by Franklin and John Adams. And historians and then other scholars have been able to tell just by their handwriting which ones were made by Franklin and which ones were made by Adams. And so it's Ben Franklin who arguably was the most philosophic, the most well-read in the classics among the committee that was assigned to create this Declaration of Independence. And I think he had a couple problems with Jefferson's original phrase, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." First of all, to call a truth undeniable is kind of a silly use of language, because anything can be denied. I could deny gravity, right? I could say, I'm going to go climb up on the building and jump off the edge and flap my arms because I deny that there's gravity. Now, gravity will prove just how foolish that is, right? Gravity will show me to be very mistaken, but I can still deny it. Anyone can deny anything. And so I think that's why Franklin didn't like that phrase undeniable. I mean, in the case of human equality, right? We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, many kings and pharaohs and Caesars had denied that. They denied it repeatedly. Sure. They didn't think all other human beings were created equal with the same rights as the king or the pharaoh or the Caesar. The second objection Franklin had was to say that a truth, we hold these truths to be sacred, that strongly suggests that they're religious truths. They're articles of some kind of religious faith. And Ben Franklin, of all people, he wanted to remove these core central ideas out of the realm of religion and establish them as foundational objective truths that don't require religious faith, that don't require membership in a particular church, some kind of, belong to a sectarian religious club or group or organization. Because what had been going on for hundreds of years in Europe, terrible wars of religious persecution. Various groups of Christians were making war on each other and slaughtering each other in huge numbers. They were warring with, and in some cases enslaving, Jews. You had Muslims and Christians and Muslims and Jews. Right? Everybody was fighting everybody in the name of religion, because typically most governments in the medieval world were connected to a church. They were ordained by a church. Usually you had some church, some kind of clergy, some kind of holy men said, God spoke to us and he said, this king right here, this is who he ordains. It was the church that granted legitimacy to a government. And if someone didn't belong to that church, or if someone openly mocked or ridiculed that church, well, that person was really undermining the legitimacy of the government. And so that connection between religion and government in the medieval world was the cause of terrible wars of religious persecution. Franklin wanted to get away from that. He did not want to say these truths are sacred. He picked a philosophic term of art. And here, this is one of the great advantages of being a member in the Vino Veritas Society, our members know so much more about this idea of self-evident than almost all other Americans. It's
Yes.
a philosophic term of art, and it stretches all the way back to Aristotle. This idea that a truth is self-evident. If many people today think, well, that means it's obvious. A truth is obvious. But in a way, to say it's obvious is like saying it's undeniable. It's a truth that everyone just has to affirm. Nobody has to affirm any truth. And that's not how Franklin meant it. It's not how the classical thinkers meant it. They did not mean it as obvious, even though that's how many modern dictionaries today define it. They meant a self-evident truth is a true proposition that it has evidence. There is evidence in the terms of the proposition. And the person who wants to discover or understand this truth has to evaluate that evidence, has to understand what the evidence is, judge it, evaluate it, reason it through. For example, every mathematical equation is a kind of a self-evident truth. There's evidence, but the evidence is contained in the terms of the proposition, in the words or the symbols or the numbers, whatever it is you're using to construct the proposition. That's what he means when he says, when he makes that correction, we hold these truths to be self-evident. These are rational, understandable ideas, and the evidence for these ideas are contained in the terms. In this famous one, in the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You would start by unpacking that word, men. All men are created equal. Well, of course, when they say men, they meant mankind, humankind. Well, what is a human being? What distinguishes human nature from non-human nature, from the nature of beasts? And very quickly you come to understand what distinguishes human beings from non-human beings is the capacity for reason, for articulate speech, for thinking with a rational mind. And in that sense, that mind is the source of our freedom. It means each of us is free to choose. And in that sense, all of us are equal. Every human being has the capacity for reason, has a free, rational mind. We really are equal. And in that sense, the evidence is contained in the terms of the proposition. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It's not a sacred truth. It's not a religious truth. It's not here. This might be one of the most important things for people to understand. That core principle in the Declaration is not an article of religious faith. It is a self-evident truth, which is a beautiful thing. It's not a bad thing. It's a beautiful thing because it means people of different faiths, people with different religious views, including some people with no religious views, they can agree on this objective, self-evident truth as the basis for the nation, the basis for political justice, the basis for our rights and the purpose of government. That little switch in words from sacred and undeniable to self-evident, I would argue, is the keystone to creating a regime of religious liberty, something that had never happened before the American founding. There was no regime of true, full-blown religious liberty where you could hold any religious view you wanted. You could go worship in any kind of church or synagogue or cathedral that you wanted, or you were free to not worship at all. There had never been a regime like that. That's what we create in America. And that idea of a self-evident truth rather than a holy truth or an article of religious faith or a sacred truth or something like that is a key part of that wonderful thing.
What's interesting about that is it really is the only way for a free society to exist. If you're going to have this melting pot that is the United States, right? This country where everybody can live here and live here freely. They all have to understand these self-evident truths. If you don't, if you say these truths only apply to this group or that group, then you can't have the type of society that our founders wanted us to have.
What's more likely is people will say these truths are accessible only to these certain people who belong to this church. In other words, if you don't have this religious background, or you're not part of a certain cult or organization or whatever it is, then you can't understand these ideas. The founders rejected that. They said, no, 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 no. Any rational mind, any human being should be able, if they think about it. I mean, right? It does require thought. You have to think it through and reason about it. But in the same way that, I don't know, the basic axioms of Euclidean geometry, you don't, right? You don't need to be a Christian to understand geometry. You don't have to be a Jew. You don't have to be a Muslim. You don't have to be an atheist. You don't have to have any particular religious views at all to understand the basic axioms of geometry, because they're self-evident truths. When you actually understand what a plane is and what a line is and what a point is, then you understand that the shortest distance between 2 points has to be a straight line. That's a truth, right? It's built into these terms and concepts, and you can reason your way to it.
The question that though becomes, what happens when, let's say, it's stayed sacred and undeniable?
Yeah.
Right. And that's a conversation I'd like to get further into before we finish this. But if it had remained that way, we talk about our laws being understandable. Essentially, that would argue that somebody who is not of a certain faith can't understand what natural rights are. They can't understand that somebody has a right to life, to liberty, to property, to pursuit of happiness. If that's the case, is that a legal defense? Does that become an open legal defense that says, well, you've told me I can't understand it. I'm a Jew.
Yeah.
I'm not of that sacred faith. Therefore, I can't possibly understand it. So if I murder somebody, does that make me just as culpable?
Right. Do the laws apply to you? I mean, here's a kind of a famous example within the Catholic tradition. There's a teaching about transubstantiation, and for the non-Catholics listening to us, this is the idea that during a Catholic Mass, during the religious ceremony, there's communion where everyone goes up and eats a little wafer. And the wafer, well, here I'm about to say something that itself was the cause of tremendous religious war.
Sure.
I was going to say the wafer represents the body of Jesus. But the Catholic teaching is that it does not merely represent, it actually becomes the flesh of Jesus during the Mass. And of course, this has been contested and disputed and challenged, and as I said, this was actually the source of all kinds of persecution and warfare, because a whole lot of people looked at that and said, it's still a wafer. I watched it during the course of the Mass, and it still looks like bread, tastes like bread. It's bread. It's not human. It's not human flesh. And part of the official Catholic teaching is, well, this is one of those canonical core beliefs. To be a Catholic means to believe transubstantiation happens, that bread transforms into flesh. So if you're a Catholic, you do believe that. If you don't believe that, then you're not really a Catholic. And if you're not a Catholic, there's no way for you to understand it. This is simply an article of Catholic faith. Well, what the Catholic Church is really saying is that then a non-Catholic, it's impossible for a non-Catholic, either a Protestant Christian or a Jew or someone of a different religious background, literally cannot understand it. It's impossible to understand. So what happens if we're not talking about transubstantiation, but instead we start talking about a criminal code? Laws against things like theft and murder and rape and assault and all those sort of things, based on some ideas that are articles of religious faith rather than self-evident truths. It leads us into all kinds of problems like you're bringing up. Well, if the foundational principles of our legal code are articles of religious faith, and I don't belong to that religion, then I can't even understand. I mentally, intellectually can't intellect what that body of law actually is, because I can't understand the fundamental principles, because I don't have that faith, and those are articles of faith. That's why the founders were so eminently wise to say, let's get away from, let's not base this nation and its laws, its government, on articles of religious faith. Let's base it on something firmer, something more objective, something that can be discerned and discovered and understood really by anybody. Then we can have a regime of real religious liberty.
Well, there's two places that we can take that, and I'm going to do the first one really quickly, and then I want to go down another path. The first point would be, people need to think where that leads, right? So if initially we start this conversation and we say, okay, so as a Jew, I can't possibly understand the law, right? Because I don't understand the faith, or I'm not a follower of that faith. So if I can't understand it,
you mean if the law was rooted in some religious faith?
Correct. Right. If it was rooted in religious faith and I didn't share that faith, right, then how do I know I'm breaking the law? How do I know that the law exists? And then we get into things in our legal code that talk about intent versus accidental death, right? And you start getting into felonies versus misdemeanors and different degrees of murder and everything else. What ends up happening, and this has happened throughout history in those religious contexts, when a country's laws are based on a religious foundation, somebody starts to make that argument. Well, I didn't understand that because I'm not of that faith. The response ends up no longer being, okay, you get a pass. The response is, okay, you can't be a part of society anymore.
That's right.
Right? Nobody's going to sit back and say, okay, you killed somebody, but you didn't know it was wrong because you're not a part of this faith. So we're going to be okay with it. And you're just going to get a slap on the wrist and you're going to go on your way. They're going to say, no, you, if you can't understand, if you can't accept the faith that teaches this, then you might as well not be a part of this society.
And I want to be clear, there were two ways to handle that, to do that. Yep. One was some form of expulsion or excommunication. Basically, you're driven out and you are no longer part of the body politic. And the other was even more bloody, was more gruesome, and that is, well, then we will execute heretics. We will cut the heads off people who refuse to convert.
I'm going to argue there's even a third, and that is, okay, you're not capable of making good decisions for yourself, so we're going to enslave you and force you to make the decision. Somebody's going to think for you. Somebody's going to tell you how your body should operate on a day-to-day basis. And so that's the scary part. On the other side of this, or in another direction on that topic, it's something else you and I have talked about. I think we've talked about it somewhat on our podcasts and sometimes in other ways. And that is this idea of esotericism, that Jefferson in particular was very esoteric in his writings. And we've had a lot of serious conversations over the last year and a half about how the compromises that had to happen in order to form the United States of America, right? Yep. We had things like the 3/5 compromise. We had things,
the importation
slavery
of slaves
coming out of the Declaration, right?
Yeah.
We had a lot of compromises because we needed the country to come together and we needed all 13 colonies to participate. Yes. That being the case, Jefferson was very direct about, over time, later in life especially, about he had to use esotericism. He had to talk in a certain way to get people to accept his words without them revolting against him.
Yeah, no. I was going to say here, I wanted to give a little shout out. I mentioned this book before. I'm still working on it. My old friend Glenn Elmers has written this wonderful kind of intellectual biography of Harry Jaffa, my teacher. And one of the things Glenn points out in the book, and he's absolutely right about this. Professor Jaffa's, his teacher, Leo Strauss, really was one of the first in the modern, within the last century, to place great emphasis on esotericism, the idea that careful thinkers and writers will write in such a way that there's a superficial message for the masses, for the many, and it plays up to their prejudices. But then there's a kind of hidden message that contradicts the superficial message. The hidden message is what the writer really believes, and it tends to be the really controversial ideas, the ideas that the masses, the many, might want to come burn, right, persecute the author for. So the author is going to be very careful about how to present those heterodox views. And so Strauss spent really his career looking at esoteric writing within the realm of philosophy. What Professor Harry Jaffa did is he took that idea of esotericism and he realized, as he was studying American political history, practical statesmen engage in esotericism because they too face large audiences of people who have strongly held prejudices, and they can't just stand up there and directly contradict the prejudices. Certainly not if you're running for office. You're not going to get elected. If you stand up and tell the entire electorate you're all stupid, you believe the wrong thing. And one of the great examples was Jaffa was really the first to place great emphasis when in those famous debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, the charge of Douglas, the accusation by the Democrats was that Republicans like Abraham Lincoln, their real agenda is they wanted to get in bed with and sleep with black women. And they made that accusation because most white people at that time found that appalling, morally repugnant. Oh my goodness, is that true? Is that what Abraham Lincoln really wants? He just has this, some weird sexual perversion for black women. Now here's the challenge. Lincoln, according to his own principles, the conclusion of his argument led to things like full voting rights for Black Americans. Black Americans should absolutely be able to vote. Black Americans should enjoy trials by jury. Black Americans should sit on juries, just like all of the citizens. But if Lincoln stood up and said that openly in 1858, if he said, yes, I think Black Americans should be voting, and I think Black and white Americans should be free to marry each other, and I think blacks should sit on juries, not only would Lincoln never have been elected to anything, he very likely would have been assassinated. I mean, he eventually was assassinated. There was an abolitionist newspaper guy, Elijah Lovejoy, who lived down the road from Lincoln in Alton, Illinois, and he was publishing these abolitionist newspapers, and he was making those kinds of arguments openly. And a big mob stormed into his store, burned it down, threw his printing press in the river, and shot him in the head. This was dangerous stuff to be making these arguments. So what Lincoln would say repeatedly, he was so careful with his wording. This is esoteric speech in the political realm. He would say, I am not now, right now, and I never have been in the past, in favor of the full political and social equality for blacks. And it's true, right then at that moment, that's not what he was just promoting, let's stop slavery from spreading out into the territories. And he had never supported full-blown political equality in the past. But he's always silent on the future. He never says, well, what he will support or won't support in the future. It leaves it open so that in the future he maybe a day will come when he could openly advocate for voting rights and jury rights and marriage rights for all Americans of all color. And then he would go and say, this idea that I just want to jump into bed with black women is silly. He looked at Judge Douglas and said right to his face, I don't have to make a slave of a black woman, nor do I have to make her a wife. I can just leave her alone. I can just respect her right to her liberty and her property. And I don't have to be sleeping with her, and I don't have to be enslaving her. And then he goes on, he says, but in her right to keep the bread that she earns with her own hands and from the sweat of her own brow, in that respect, she is my equal and she's Judge Douglas's equal, and she's the equal of every other human being. That's that core idea of equality presented in a kind of esoteric way, because the prejudices of Lincoln's audience were so strong. It was
Right.
impractical or impossible to just stand out and speak openly about what he really thought.
So hearing all that about Lincoln, I go back to Jefferson and Franklin. And I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in that room as those edits were being made, because you could imagine, knowing Jefferson's general beliefs and leanings from the letters he's written and the correspondence he had before his death. You could imagine that he knew what he was doing. And when Franklin came in with that edit, they probably had a lengthy conversation about what level of esotericism needs to be in this declaration to get everybody to buy in, to get 56 people to sign it and say,
Yeah.
we're gonna potentially commit treason. We are gonna commit treason against the crown, and if we don't win, we're all gonna be killed.
We need a lot of people to agree. And here is the reality of their situation. The people they needed to support the Declaration were all very pious Christians. I mean, they were. That was the reality of their situation. And so I guarantee part of Jefferson's rhetorical strategy there is, let's frame this in language that all the Christians will like, that they'll agree with. So let's call this a sacred truth, because then they'll say, yes, we agree with that truth if it's sacred. And there's Ben Franklin pushing back, saying, well, hang on. If we start this country on the idea of sacred truths, we're really opening up the whole can of worms of some theocratic form of government, which is going to be its own problem. Maybe we can get all the Christians to unite in this revolutionary cause, but then what we'll be left with at the end is a theocracy, and that's not good. And this, right? So trying to figure out how exactly to position these ideas and talk about these things become really, really important. And it's it's funny. Many observers, scholars, pundits will they'll poo-poo this idea of esotericism. Oh, that's just silly. These great statesmen and these great philosophers, they just spoke their mind. They just put on paper whatever they were thinking. And yet, even the most beginning student of communication knows that rule number one is know your audience. And why? Why do you have to know your audience? Because you got to know how to craft the message, right? And the messaging and the images and whatever else you're going to use for communication that will appeal to and not repulse your audience. That's why you got to know your audience. Well, if advertisers and marketers know their audience, and for the most part they do, it's why they're good at what they do. Is it silly to think that John Locke knew his audience, or Thomas Jefferson knew his audience, or Ben Franklin or Abraham Lincoln?
There's this saying, and I wish I knew who to attribute it to, but you hear a lot of times people say what you mean and mean what you say. But that doesn't always work, and especially in politics, you have to get buy-in from people, and it really flies in the face of that. You have to get buy-in. You have to get people, especially in something so big that you're actually calling for not only a departure and a withdrawal from another country. You were talking about going against God for a lot of people, right? We've talked about this on podcasts before. God put King George in charge. King George was because God put him there, and to say King George is no longer your king, and you want to separate from the church and the royalty of England, that takes more than just, okay, I don't really like this anymore. And I think we throw around the idea of secession in the United States a lot lately. It was a huge deal then, because not only were you going against a king, but you were going against God.
Well, and backed up by tremendous theological authority. If there was any doubt, if anyone had any doubt whether George was the rightful king of the British Empire, you could go consult the Church of England, the head of which was George, and
Right.
George, as the head of the Anglican Church, would tell you that, of course, God has revealed to the Church of England that George is supposed to be the king. So, we're talking the great challenge of not lying, and at the same time carefully presenting the truth with some
Right.
art, with some craft, in a way that will inspire and attract a coalition that you need to get the job done. In the case of the Revolution, that's Jefferson and Franklin. In the case of trying to abolish slavery, in the case of Lincoln, and then eventually the Civil War. And we're talking about words. Think of the same thing is happening today. For example, those who want to build a large central planning administrative state. They want to attract a big coalition. They want supporters. Maybe not everyone who will vote their way fully understands it, but they don't care. They still want their votes. So what kind of labels do they use? They used to use the word progressive, and then they started to use the word liberal. The word progressive they kind of invented. That was a new political term. It was a new concept. It was very much connected to
Right.
modern technology, which modern scientific technology was itself a pretty new phenomenon. New inventions and new machinery. So there was this great enthusiasm for this idea of progress. Everything's going to get better. Then in the 1930s and 40s, FDR and other New Dealers latched onto an older word, liberal, and said, no, we're not really progressive. We're liberals, which
Right.
really added confusion to our politics, because these guys were promoting a lot of central planning, all kinds of regulatory control over Americans, and subsidizing and taxing at unprecedented rates. And yet they were doing this in the name of liberalism, which is what Jefferson and Madison and Franklin, they called themselves liberals. Adam Smith called himself a liberal. John Locke called himself a liberal. At the same time, in the United States today, there are people who they're patriotic. They love their country. They love the founding of this country. They love the idea, the hope of a constitutionally limited government. And they're trying to build a coalition and attract people. And so they're looking for words that they can use that will attract and inspire. And one of the words they've been using now for decades is the word conservative. If we say we're
Right.
conservatives, right, that will attract the kind of people to our cause. But just like how the word liberal is filled with confusion and problems, the word conservative is also filled with confusion and ambiguity and multiple meanings. I mean, kind of on its surface, when you think of conserving, it really means to protect, to preserve. Conserve is very similar to preserve, and it means maintaining the status quo, keeping things as they are right now, being resistant to
Hmm.
change. But most people who think of themselves as conservative today, they don't want to preserve the status quo. The status quo is a huge, sprawling, progressive administrative state. That's what we have right now. Most conservatives in this very confused way are kind of revolutionaries. They want to get rid of. They want some big radical change.
Hmm.
It's conservatives who will talk about things like, let's abolish the Department of Education, right? That would be a
Right.
big change to our federal government. That's not conservative in the sense of resisting change. That's advocating for a great big change. And so that whole notion
Hmm.
of that word conservative raises this big, and in some ways, I would argue, perhaps one of the most important questions of our age. What is it we should be conserving? What is it that conservatives want to conserve? We were talking earlier about Harry Jaffa and Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss, the famous professor of political philosophy, spent most of his career at the University of Chicago. He loved to point out in class to his students when he would be talking about these words and how strange they are. Right, conservative usually means resistant to change, reluctant to change, the opposite of revolutionary. Right, a revolutionary wants big explosive change. So a conservative is just trying to keep things the way they are. And and Strauss loved to point out that the most conservative group in modern America is the daughters of the American Revolution. He would say this back in the
Right.
1950s and 1960s when that was true. But think about that. The daughters of the American right, a revolutionary group that launched a revolution, their heirs generations later are very conservative because they're trying to conserve, protect the revolution, or at least the ideas of the revolution. And in a way, that's an ongoing and real challenge for the conservative movement, for conservative thinkers. How do you conserve revolutionary ideas, a revolutionary spirit,
Hmm.
which is the spirit out of which America was founded?
Well, I think the point you just made is that the word conservative really doesn't have a clear definition. And a lot of people will say, I'm a conservative, but it means very different things to very different people. You have some people who say, I'm a conservative, and to them, that means conserving what they call traditional family values. For
Mhm.
others, it's conserving the principles or the ideas of the American founding.
And let me add a complication in that, because when some conservatives say what we really care about are traditional family values. Well, to care about traditional family values means you care about traditional things. You care about tradition,
Hmm.
because traditional family values is part of this larger category of tradition. And this is where liberals and progressives will say, well, there are other things that are traditional, like racism and slavery. That's traditional. That's really old. I bet you want to conserve those too. And so by sort of focusing in on that notion of what's old and what's traditional, I think many conservatives find it difficult intellectually
Yes.
or in principle to make these distinctions about, well, what parts of tradition are good and worth conserving, and what parts of tradition are morally repugnant and should we let go and ignore and move on.
And that's why you have problems today of you hear, if somebody tells you I'm part of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, you know where they stand, you know what they want. It doesn't require
Yeah.
further explanation. If you say I'm a conservative, it doesn't mean a whole lot to anybody. All it does is prompt extra questions. And generally, if you're going to have a conversation with somebody, they don't even want to know the answers. They just say, okay, so you must be one of this type of conservative because this is what I know a conservative to be. And it goes back to the very beginning of our conversation, which is, if words don't mean the same thing to everybody, if we don't all share common
Mhm.
definitions of words, how do you have any kind of conversation or learning or agreement within a society?
Yeah, so sometimes I've seen some funny presentations of that. If there's a comedian who does this whole bit about an Englishman in the United States trying to bum a cigarette, and the English word, the term they use for cigarettes is a fag,
Right.
and so he's walking around asking anyone, right, if they have a fag, and what it shows is you have two groups of people who have assigned very different meanings to the same word, and they really can't have a conversation because they're using two completely different concepts. And in a way, that is one of our great challenges today, is just clarifying. Set aside whether we think what these words represent are good or bad, or whether we want to
Mhm.
challenge them or accept them or reject them. Can we just come to a common agreement about what they mean? That in itself would be a gigantic step forward, just to get that clarity on what these key terms mean.
Well, that, or in some circumstances, you'll never come to an agreement on what things mean, right? And I think the word conservative is one of those. You'll never get a group of 30 conservatives in a room who can all agree on what that term actually means. And that's why sometimes new words are created. The progressives created the word progressive, and it
Hmm.
eventually allowed them to co-opt that word liberal. But it might mean starting new words and sharing those and using those on a daily basis. And that's a great opportunity for a group like ours, like the Vino Veritas Society, to start defining what is it to want to conserve the American idea, to guard the American idea as we seek to. And maybe that's a good takeaway and good challenge for our listeners and those watching.
It's a great exercise, and I want to just frame it in a slightly larger way. You're right. If you have 30 conservatives in a room, it's likely none of them are going to agree what it means to be a conservative. And then there's an additional layer of challenge, and that is if you add 30 progressives into the room, the progressives they're going to reject any definition of conservative that they think might give conservatives some political advantage that might be good for the right. They have a political interest in defining that word conservative in a way that is the most damning. So they're going to say, well, conservative means racist. That's what it means to be a conservative, is you have to be a racist. And so given how toxic these words have become, and I think you're right, there's not going to be any consensus anywhere in the near future on what the word conservative means, or for that matter, liberal or progressive. It's not a bad thing to start thinking about other ways to brand and represent and symbolize in words the kind of foundational ideas that we're trying to preserve as Americans and as members of the Vino Veritas Society.
Absolutely. It's a great way for us to be guardians. It's a great way for us to achieve the goals of the organization.
Actually, maybe here's what our members can think about. I mean, we have this great motto, no sumos custodes. We are the guardians. A challenge that we should put out to our members is, how do we explain what it is that we're guarding? How do you explain, as a member of the Vino Veritas Society, when you're talking to people and they want to know why you're a member of this group, what words are useful to you? What way of messaging and communicating have you found to be useful in describing what it is we're guarding and why we're guarding that, why we think that's important?
Absolutely. And with that, we'll continue this conversation over the next few weeks. I think there's a lot more to take on and to explore with some of these ideas, and we will continue to guard the American idea in the meantime.
All right, go get some rest, Dave. We all hope you feel better soon.
Thank you. No sumus custodes.
Till next time.